summarize, first of all, the reasons that all of these scholars give for why they don't think this story was in the gospel when John wrote it, but got added later. Let me summarize those and then give you some background about the transmission of the text in the New Testament, and then draw out a lesson for us, both biblically for its authority's sake and spiritually for our souls. Here are the reasons. Number one, the story is missing in all the Greek manuscripts before the 5th century.
Well, first of all, I would say that statement is a little bit misleading. I mean, the truth is we don't have many Greek manuscripts at all that date before the 5th century. We have some papyri manuscripts, but we have only a handful that relate to the Gospel of John, and those are papyri that come from the so-called Alexandrian tradition, and they omit the Pericope Adulterae, but we wouldn't be surprised at that because the Alexandrian tradition omits the PA. That's really kind of begs the question. But we really don't have a lot of early manuscript evidence to support the Gospel of John in general. The earliest unsealed manuscripts that we have are Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus and Codex Alexandrinus. They're from the 4th and 5th centuries. But on the other hand, there are some early Greek manuscripts that do have the Pericope Adulterae. The earliest one that has it is Codex D, Codex Beza, and then we might add it does eventually appear in the great majority of the Greek manuscripts. Again, when I was at the Pericope Adulterae conference, Maurice Robinson, who's collated the manuscripts, points out that the Pericope Adulterae appears in 1,476 manuscripts of John. So it does become the majority reading. It's also there in some of the early versional witnesses. It's there in the Old Latin, which dates to the early centuries of the Christian movement. And I picked up Edward Hill's book, The King James Version Defended, and I know this book sometimes is controversial. It's not a KJV only really type book as much as it is a defense of the traditional text of Scripture. But he has a section on the Pericope Adulterae, as you might imagine, and he discusses some of the early witnesses to the Pericope Adulterae. He points out, for example, that it is referred to in the Church Father Ambrose in the late 4th century. It's also referred to by Ambrose's protege Augustine. And Augustine even offers an explanation for why it was omitted. This is a quotation here from Hills on page 151 from Augustine, where he said, "Certain persons of little faith, or rather enemies of the true faith, fearing, I suppose, lest their wives should be given impunity in sinning, removed from their manuscripts the Lord's act of forgiveness toward the adulteress, as if he who had said, 'Sin no more,' had granted permission to sin." And see, that's an explanation for why, in Augustine's opinion, the passage had dropped out in some Greek manuscripts. And he's writing that in 400 AD. He goes on to mention that it is in the 5th century Greek manuscript D, Codex Beza. It's also Jerome, who did his Vulgate in 415 AD, mentions the fact that there are Greek manuscripts that omit the Pericope Adulterae. No one is protesting or saying that it didn't have a protested textual history, but Jerome did decide to include the Pericope Adulterae in his Latin Vulgate. Hills also points out that the Pericope Adulterae is cited in an early Christian work called the Didaskalia, or Teaching of the Apostles, and also in the related work called the Apostolic Constitutions, which date to the 3rd and 4th centuries. There is a reference to the woman caught in adultery in the church father Eusebius in the early 4th century. There is some dispute about that reference as to whether he knew that it was in the Gospel of John as opposed to knowing it as an account that was told by Papias or that appeared in another early work called the Gospel according to the Hebrews. It's also, according to Hills, cited in the Spanish church father Pacian or Pacian, I'm not sure how you pronounce it, around 370 AD. So, again, it's a little bit deceptive to say we reject it because it doesn't appear in a Greek manuscript until the 5th century. We don't have many witnesses. We don't have many unsealed manuscripts in the New Testament, in particular, that date any earlier than the 5th century. And, there's a whole other principle here too, and that is that just because a manuscript is earlier doesn't mean it's the best manuscript. And I always think of the example of the Old Testament. The earliest manuscripts that we had for years of the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament was the Leningrad Codex, which dates to the year 1008 AD. And so, for years, that was the oldest manuscript we had of the Hebrew Bible. If you assume that the oldest parts of the Old Testament were written in 1500 BC by Moses, and the most recent parts of the Old Testament were written, maybe Ezra and Nehemiah, in the 5th century BC, that means that for years, the earliest Hebrew manuscript that we had of the Bible, again, was 5th century BC to 1500 years old, with the Mosaic literature, maybe as much as 2,500 years old. It's not really a matter of the age of the manuscript. It's really a matter of the accuracy of the manuscript. And of course, the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, and this gave us earlier Hebrew manuscripts, which by and large supported the traditional Hebrew text. But my point is, it's really not a convincing argument to say we reject the Pericope Adulterae because we only have Greek manuscript evidence from the 5th century. If we use that kind of criteria, we would be rejecting lots more of the foundation of the reliability of the New Testament.
Clearly and admittedly, there was controversy over whether the story should be included in the text of John in the early church, because some early Christians objected to what they considered to be Jesus' lax view toward the adulterer. The antiquity of the story is beyond challenge.